1965. Stan Laurel is lying in a hospital bed, 84 years old, alone, broke, forgotten by Hollywood. The man who once made the entire world laugh, who was half of one of the most beloved duos in film history, is dying in silence. His partner, Oliver Hardy, had already passed 8 years earlier. And look, before we continue with this incredible story, subscribe to this channel right now and turn on notifications, because every week I bring stories of icons who changed culture and deserve to be remembered. I guarantee you won't want to miss the next one. Now the golden age of comedy had ended decades ago, and as Stan breathed his last breaths in that hospital, few remembered the empire of laughter that he and Babe Hardy had built. But here's the thing. The story of Laurel and Hardy isn't just about comedy. It's about friendship, about loyalty, about two men who refused to betray each other, even when Hollywood discarded them, even when the money ran out, even when nobody cared anymore. If you stay until the end of this video, you'll discover why this comedy duo forever changed the way we laugh, and why 1965 marked the end of an era that will never return. And if you've never watched a Laurel and Hardy film, you're missing something fundamental in cinema history. Now tell me, have you ever watched a classic Laurel and Hardy film? Do you know their story? Comment down below, because this story is going to move you in ways you don't expect. All right? Prepare your heart, because this journey goes from the absolute top to the saddest bottom of the entertainment industry. The story begins decades before 1965, in the early 20th century, when cinema was still discovering how to make people laugh. Stan Laurel was born in England in 1890, the son of theatre actors. From childhood, he was on stage, learning comic timing, learning how to make an audience react. He came to America as a young man, chasing the dream of making it in vaudeville, the entertainment circuit that dominated before cinema took over. He was talented, hard-working, but just one among hundreds of comedians trying to survive in that brutal industry. Oliver Hardy, whom everyone called Babe, was born in Georgia in 1892. His family expected him to follow a respectable path, but Babe was big, charismatic, had a natural way of commanding attention. He started in silent films in the early days, making hundreds of short films, always as a supporting player, always backing up other comedians. He was reliable, professional, but nobody thought he'd be a star on his own. He was too big, too slow-moving for the fast-paced slapstick that dominated silent comedy. Stan and Oliver worked separately for years, sometimes even at the same studio, without ever really collaborating. Then in 1927, fate brought them together. A director at the Hal Roach studio decided to put them together in a short film. And something extraordinary happened. The chemistry between them was immediate, undeniable, absolutely perfect. Stan, thin and confused with those sad puppy eyes. Oliver, large and pompous, always trying to maintain dignity while everything collapsed around him. Together, they created something that transcended simple physical comedy. They created a completely new comic language, and the audience went absolutely crazy. Suddenly, Laurel and Hardy were the biggest stars in cinema. They made dozens of short films throughout the late 20s, and each one was a masterpiece of comic timing. The way they looked at the camera after a disaster, that perfectly timed pause before the next catastrophe, the way Oliver adjusted his tie with absurd dignity while everything exploded around him. How Stan cried like a child when things went wrong. It wasn't just funny, it was art. It was comedy elevated to the level of ballet, every movement perfectly choreographed, every facial expression telling a story. What made Laurel and Hardy special was that their comedy came from character, not just from gags. You cared about these two guys. You wanted them to succeed even though you knew they'd fail. You understood their relationship. The way Stan looked up to Oliver even though Oliver wasn't actually any smarter. The way Oliver protected Stan even while being frustrated with him. It was a friendship, something real and human underneath all the slapstick chaos. As cinema evolved from silent to sound in the late 20s, many careers died overnight. Comedians who depended only on facial expressions and physical actions suddenly seemed dated. But Laurel and Hardy made the transition perfectly. Why? Because they never depended only on the physical. They had personalities, dynamics, a real emotional relationship that the audience loved. When they started talking, It got even better. Stan's high-pitched, whiny voice was perfect for his childlike character. Oliver's deep, pompous voice with that southern gentility was ideal for his pretentious persona. Their arguments, Stan's confused explanations, Oliver's exasperated responses, all of it worked magnificently. During the 30s, Laurel and Hardy dominated completely. They weren't just movie stars, they were global cultural phenomena. Children imitated their gestures, adults quoted their lines, they were recognized instantly anywhere in the world. They made classic feature films like Sons of the Desert, Way Out West, and Blockheads. Each film was a perfectly tuned machine of comedy, with Stan often writing and contributing creatively, and Oliver bringing his magnetic presence and impeccable timing. And here's something crucial to understand. Stan Laurel was the creative genius behind most of it. Oliver was brilliant. His comic timing and physical presence were irreplaceable. But Stan was the one who wrote most of the material, who came up with the gags, who directed many of the films without credit, who understood the mechanics of comedy on a deep, almost scientific level. He would spend hours working out the timing of a single sequence, figuring out exactly how long a pause should be, exactly what expression Oliver should make. He was a perfectionist, obsessed with getting every detail right. And Oliver trusted him completely, understood that Stan's vision was what made their films work. Their partnership off-screen was as beautiful as their partnership on-screen. They genuinely liked each other, spent time together even when they weren't working, considered each other true friends. In an industry full of egos and rivalry and backstabbing, Laurel and Hardy were loyal to each other, supportive of each other, protective of each other. When contracts were being negotiated, they insisted on being paid equally, even though Stan was doing more of the creative work. Stan said they were a team, that one couldn't succeed without the other, and he meant it. That kind of integrity, that kind of genuine partnership was rare in Hollywood then, and it's rare now. But here is where the story begins to get dark. Because Hollywood, this brutal money-making machine, never really respected Laurel and Hardy the way it should have. They were treated as contract workers, not as the creative geniuses they were. The studios made enormous fortunes from their films, but Stan and Oliver didn't own their work, didn't control their careers, didn't get the profit participation that would have made them truly wealthy. They were paid well by the standards of the time, but nowhere near what they generated for the studios. And as the 30s turned into the 40s, as tastes changed, as a new generation of comedians emerged, the studios began to lose interest. The shorts weren't as profitable anymore. Audiences wanted features. But when they made features, the studios wouldn't give them the budgets they needed, wouldn't give them the time to perfect their material. Worse, the studios started interfering creatively, hiring directors who didn't understand their dynamic, forcing them to work with scripts they hadn't written, taking away the control that had made their earlier work so brilliant. The films they made in the 40s, after leaving Hal Roach and signing with bigger studios, were mostly terrible. Not because Stan and Oliver had lost their talent, but because they were being suffocated by the system. MGM and Fox made them do films with weak scripts, low budgets, and no understanding of what made Laurel and Hardy special. Stan would try to rewrite the scripts, try to add their signature gags and character moments, but he was overruled by executives who thought they knew better. The audiences could tell. The magic wasn't there, the films weren't funny. And Hollywood blamed the comedians instead of the system destroying them. By the late 40s, their contracts weren't being renewed. Nobody was making offers. They were seen as has-beens, relics of an earlier era. And imagine how devastating that must have been. They had spent 20 years being among the most famous people on the planet, making millions laugh, being celebrated everywhere they went. And suddenly nothing. The phones stopped ringing. The offers disappeared. Hollywood had decided they were done. But here's what separates Laurel and Hardy from so many others. They stayed together. They could have gone separate ways. Stan could have tried to reinvent himself as a writer or director. Oliver could have tried character acting, dramatic roles, but they didn't do that. Because their partnership wasn't just professional, it was a genuine, deep friendship. They cared about each other as human beings, so they decided, if Hollywood doesn't want them, they'll go where people still love them. In the early 50s, Laurel and Hardy toured Europe. They performed in theaters, music halls, anywhere that would have them. And what happened was absolutely extraordinary. Massive crowds showed up everywhere they went. In England, in France, in Denmark, in Italy, thousands of people came to see them. People who had grown up watching their films, who had memorized every gesture and every joke, who considered Stan and Oliver an essential part of their lives. The tours were triumphant, emotional, sometimes overwhelming. Grown men cried meeting their childhood heroes. Families brought multiple generations. Stan and Oliver were shocked by the reception. They had been told by Hollywood that nobody cared about them anymore, that they were forgotten. And here were thousands of people proving that was a lie. The love was real, the appreciation was genuine, and it renewed their spirits, made them feel valued again. But these tours were also physically brutal. Stan was in his early 60s by then, Oliver in his late 50s and early 60s. The constant traveling was exhausting, sleeping in different hotels every night, dealing with trains and cars and boats. The performances themselves were demanding, especially for Oliver, who was doing physical comedy while dealing with serious health issues. He had struggled with his weight his entire life. It had been part of his screen persona. But now it was killing him. His heart was under constant strain, his joints ached, simple movements were painful. Doctors warned Oliver repeatedly that he needed to stop, to rest, to lose weight immediately, or he'd have a heart attack or stroke. But how could he stop? Making people laugh was who he was, his identity, his purpose, and doing it alongside Stan, his best friend, his partner of nearly 30 years, was the thing he loved most in the world. So he kept going, kept performing, kept pushing his body past its limits. And then in 1954, disaster struck. Oliver Hardy had a massive stroke while getting out of a bathtub. It was catastrophic. Half his body was partially paralyzed. His speech was slurred and difficult. His face drooped on one side. He couldn't walk without assistance, couldn't do the physical comedy that had been his trademark. The doctors said he'd probably never work again, that he should consider himself lucky to be alive. For a man like Oliver Hardy, whose entire life had been about performance, about movement, about physical presence, this was devastating beyond words. His body, which had been his instrument, had betrayed him. He was trapped inside it, unable to do the things that defined him. The frustration was immense. The depression was profound. Stan Laurel was heartbroken watching his friend suffer. He visited Oliver constantly, multiple times a week, bringing him news, telling him stories, trying to keep his spirits up. Stan would talk about plans for the future, about projects they'd do when Oliver recovered, about tours they'd go on. Both of them knew these were probably fantasies, that Oliver would likely never perform again. But the fantasy was important. It gave Oliver something to hope for. And here's what shows you who Stan Laurel really was. Offers came in for him to work solo. There were people who wanted to hire Stan as a writer, as a consultant, as a performer. He could have made money, stayed active, kept his own career going. But Stan said no to every single offer. Because for Stan, there was no Laurel without Hardy. They were a team, an inseparable unit, and if Oliver couldn't work, then Stan wouldn't work either. That's loyalty. That's friendship. That's refusing to abandon your partner when things get difficult. Oliver fought with everything he had for 3 years after that stroke. He went to physical therapy, forced himself through painful exercises, tried to regain function. He lost some weight, regained some ability to speak clearly, managed to walk short distances with a cane. But his heart, which had been damaged by decades of obesity and stress, kept getting weaker. On August 7, 1957, Oliver Hardy died of another stroke, this one massive and fatal. He was 65 years old. Stan Laurel was absolutely destroyed. He had lost not just his work partner, not just his professional other half, but his best friend, his brother in every way that mattered. They had shared everything, success and failure, joy and hardship. And now Oliver was gone, and Stan was alone in a way he'd never been before. The funeral was attended by comedians and entertainers from the old days, but there were no big tributes from the studios, no recognition from the industry that had made billions from their work. Hollywood had moved on, was focused on the next generation, and didn't have time to properly honor a man who had brought joy to millions. After Oliver's death, Stan could have disappeared completely from public life. Many people expected him to. What was the point of continuing without his partner? But Stan had a quiet dignity, a resilience that people underestimated. He spent the last 8 years of his life in his apartment in Santa Monica, living modestly with his wife, Ida. Money was tight. They weren't wealthy, but they had enough to get by. But Stan didn't become bitter or isolated. He did something remarkable. He answered his fan mail personally. Every single letter that came, and there were hundreds over those years, Stan would read and respond to himself. He'd type out answers on his typewriter, sharing memories of Oliver, telling stories from the old days, expressing genuine gratitude to people who took the time to write. Some of his correspondents he exchanged letters with for years, developing actual friendships through the mail. Stan also watched his old films on television. When they'd play late at night or on weekend afternoons, he'd sit and watch, laughing at jokes he'd written 50 years earlier, admiring Oliver's timing and grace, remembering the days on set. He wasn't nostalgic in a sad way. He was genuinely appreciative of what they'd accomplished, proud of the work. He'd receive letters from young people saying they'd just discovered Laurel and Hardy and thought they were hilarious, and it warmed his heart to know the work wasn't forgotten. Hollywood, unfortunately, didn't share that appreciation. There were no special awards, no lifetime achievement recognition from the Academy, no tributes from the industry Stan had helped build. The man who had pioneered comic techniques that every comedian since had borrowed from was living in obscurity, while mediocre talents received honors and acclaim. It was unjust, it was wrong, but it was completely typical of how Hollywood operates. In early 1965, Stan's health began to decline. He'd had heart problems for years, and in February, he had what his doctors initially thought was just chest pain, but quickly realized was a significant cardiac event. He was hospitalized, but both Stan and the doctors knew this was probably the beginning of the end. His heart was failing, his body was shutting down. Stan faced his impending death with the same grace and humor he'd faced everything else. He joked with nurses, told stories to doctors, remained mentally sharp even as his body failed. He thought about Oliver a lot during those final days, wondering what came next, hoping there was something after death where he'd see his friend again. He had no regrets about his life, about the choices he'd made. He'd done work he was proud of. He'd been part of something special. He'd made millions of people happy. He'd been a good friend, a loyal partner. On February 23, 1965, at 1:30 in the afternoon, Stan Laurel died of a heart attack in Santa Monica. He was 74 years old. His wife Ida was with him. His last words, reportedly, were a joke to the nurse, making people smile literally until his last breath. And here's the part that breaks my heart. When Stan Laurel died, the entertainment industry he had helped create barely noticed. There were small obituaries in the papers, a few paragraphs mentioning his career. Some comedians who knew what they owed him made statements about his influence. But there was no massive outpouring from Hollywood, no special tributes, no recognition proportional to his contributions. The Academy Awards that year didn't even mention him in their in memoriam segment. The man who had defined physical comedy was ignored by the industry he'd devoted his life to. But the public remembered. Ordinary people around the world, when they heard that Stan Laurel had died, felt genuine grief. Because to them, Laurel and Hardy weren't just entertainers. They were part of their lives, part of their childhoods, part of their happiest memories. They were the films families watched together, the jokes that got passed down through generations. An era was truly over now. So what do we learn from this story? Why does 1965 matter so much? It matters because it marked the definitive end of something irreplaceable. With Stan's death, the generation that had created Hollywood comedy was essentially gone. Chaplin was still alive, but retired. Keaton was around, but barely working. The Marx Brothers had split up. Stan Laurel's death closed the book on a chapter of film history that will never be written again. But here's the redemption in this sad story. Laurel and Hardy won in the end. Because we're sitting here decades later still talking about them, still watching their films, still laughing at the same gags that made people laugh in 1930. Their work hasn't just survived, it's thrived. Every generation discovers them anew, usually starting when they're kids, immediately getting the humor even though the films are in black and white. The comedy is timeless, universal, as funny now as it was 100 years ago, and their influence is everywhere. Everybody comedy owes something to Laurel and Hardy. Every time you see two characters with contrasting personalities getting into escalating trouble, that's the template they created. The straight man and the fool, the pompous one and the innocent one. The dynamic where disaster follows disaster in perfect comic progression, all of that came from Stan and Oliver. Comedians from every generation cite them as influences, study their films to understand timing and structure, and their partnership became the gold standard for artistic collaboration. When people talk about true creative partnerships, about two people being more than the sum of their parts, about loyalty and friendship in a cutthroat industry, Laurel and Hardy are the example. They proved that you don't have to betray your partner to succeed, that sticking together through the bad times is what creates something lasting. Stan could have abandoned Oliver after the stroke and worked solo. Oliver could have resented Stan for being the more creative one, but they never did any of that. They remained faithful to each other until the very end. Hollywood treated them terribly. The industry used them while they were profitable, underpaid them, took their creative control, then discarded them when fashions changed, and forgot them when they most deserved recognition. It's a pattern that continues to this day. But Stan and Oliver transcended that mistreatment. They created art that outlasted the studios that exploited them, created joy that continues long after the executives who dismissed them are forgotten. When you watch a Laurel and Hardy film now, you're not just seeing comedy, you're seeing history. You're seeing the moment when film comedy became an art form. You're seeing two men who genuinely loved each other working together to create something perfect. Every look they exchange, every gesture, every perfectly timed pause comes from years of collaboration, from deep understanding of each other, from friendship that went beyond just working together. And there's a lesson here about success that goes far beyond comedy. If you judge Stan Laurel and Oliver Hardy purely by how they ended, broke and forgotten by the industry, you'd think their lives were failures. But that's the wrong way to measure a life. The real measure is impact, is the joy created, is the art produced. By those standards, Laurel and Hardy were extraordinarily successful. They lived fully, created brilliantly, loved genuinely, maintained integrity when it would have been easy to compromise. Stan could have worked without Oliver and made more money. Oliver could have left Stan behind when his health started failing. But they chose partnership over self-interest, chose friendship over career optimization. And that choice, which might have seemed financially foolish, turned out to be the thing that made them immortal. Because we don't remember them as Stan Laurel and Oliver Hardy, two separate performers. We remember them as Laurel and Hardy, one indivisible entity, a partnership so perfect it became inseparable in our collective memory. 1965 marked the end of their physical lives, but it couldn't touch what they'd created together. The films remain, the laughter continues, the influence spreads. Every time someone discovers their work for the first time and starts laughing, Stan and Oliver live again. Every time a comedian studies their techniques and learns from their mastery, their knowledge passes on. Every time someone tells a story about watching their films with their parents or grandparents, the emotional connection they created continues. So yes, it's sad that Stan died in a hospital with Hollywood barely noticing. Yes, it's tragic that Oliver suffered for years. Yes, it's unjust that the industry never properly honored them while they were alive. But focus on that, and you miss the bigger picture. They won. They beat the system that tried to exploit and discard them. They created something the system couldn't destroy or take away. They made people happy. They created art. They loved each other and stayed loyal. They did good work and lived decent lives. If you've never watched a Laurel and Hardy film, please do yourself a favor and find one. Start with Way Out West or Sons of the Desert. Let yourself enter that black and white world where two friends face chaos together. Let yourself laugh at jokes that were written almost a century ago and still work perfectly. Let yourself see what true comic genius looks like, what perfect partnership creates. And when you watch, remember what you're seeing. You're seeing two men who refused to betray each other for money. You're seeing friendship that survived everything Hollywood could throw at it. You're seeing artists who maintained their integrity even when it cost them their careers. You're seeing something precious and rare, something that existed once perfectly and has never been matched since. Rest in peace, Stan Laurel. Rest in peace, Oliver Hardy. Thank you for the laughter. Thank you for the art. Thank you for showing us what true partnership looks like. Thank you for proving that making people happy is a noble purpose. You deserved better from Hollywood, but you got something more valuable. Eternal love from everyone who ever watched your films and felt their spirits lift. That's a better legacy than any award could ever be. Now tell me in the comments, did you know the story of Laurel and Hardy's later years? Have you watched their classic films? What's your favorite moment? And don't forget, we bring these stories every week to honor the legends who deserve to be remembered. Until next time, and never forget, true success isn't measured by money or fame, but by the love you create and the joy you bring to the world.